Before Persia ruled the largest empire the ancient world had yet seen, it existed as a peripheral highland society. Politically subordinate, archaeologically modest, and overshadowed by older imperial powers. Its transformation into an imperial state was neither sudden nor accidental, but the result of long-term geographic position, shifting regional power, and gradual political consolidation. The Iranian plateau formed the environmental foundation of early Persian development. Stretching between Mesopotamia, Central Asia, and the Zagros Mountains, this region consisted of arid uplands, seasonal pastures, and limited agricultural zones. Archaeological surveys indicate dispersed settlement patterns rather than dense urban centers, favoring pastoralism alongside localized farming. These conditions shaped societies that were mobile, clan-based, and militarily adaptable, but initially incapable of sustaining large-scale centralized administration. By the early 1st millennium BCE, Indo-Iranian-speaking groups occupied much of this plateau. Among them were the Persians, a tribal population centered in the region later known as Parsa, near modern Fars. Assyrian records from the 9th century BCE make indirect reference to groups that may correspond to early Persians, though such identifications remain cautious. What is clearer is that these groups existed on the margins of stronger states, particularly Elam to the southwest and Media to the northwest. The political subordination of the Persians under Median authority appears central to their early development. Classical sources, including Herodotus, describe the Persians as vassals of the Medes prior to the mid-6th century BCE. While Herodotus writes centuries later, this general framework is supported by Near Eastern political patterns following the collapse of the Neo-Assyrian Empire around 612 BCE. In the power vacuum that followed Assyria's fall, the Medes emerged as the dominant force across much of western Iran, exercising hegemony over smaller tribal groups, including the Persians of Anshan. Anshan itself holds particular significance in reconstructing early Achaemenid history. Archaeological excavations in the region reveal continuity from Elamite occupation into the Persian period, indicating that early Persian elites inherited administrative practices and settlement frameworks from earlier cultures. Later Achaemenid inscriptions, notably those commissioned by Darius I, refer retrospectively to ancestors such as Achaemenes and Teispes. Although these figures are not directly attested in contemporary records, their inclusion in royal genealogies suggests a conscious effort to assert dynastic legitimacy rooted in local authority. Teispes is credited in these inscriptions with ruling both Anshan and Persia, implying a consolidation of territories previously fragmented among tribal leaders. This unification likely occurred gradually, facilitated by Median oversight rather than outright independence. Rather than forming an empire, early Persian leadership functioned within an existing imperial hierarchy, gaining experience in governance, military service, and tribute systems. Such arrangements were typical of Near Eastern imperial models, where dominant powers relied on local elites to administer peripheral regions. The broader Near Eastern context further shaped Persian political evolution. The destruction of Assyrian urban centers destabilized long-standing trade networks, while Babylon and Media competed for regional influence. These shifting conditions allowed subordinate groups room to maneuver. Records indicate increased interaction between Iranian groups and Mesopotamian states during this period, particularly through military service and diplomatic exchange. Such contact exposed Persian elites to administrative models later reflected in Achaemenid governance. Material culture from this early phase remains limited, but its absence is itself informative. The lack of monumental architecture prior to Cyrus II suggests that Persian authority had not yet assumed overtly imperial forms. Instead, power remained personal and dynastic, expressed through lineage and territorial control rather than urban symbolism. This contrasts sharply with later Achaemenid practices, underscoring the transitional nature of the period. By the late 7th and early 6th centuries BCE, the balance of power in western Iran began to shift. Median authority, while extensive, lacked the administrative cohesion of earlier Assyrian rule. Internal divisions and reliance on loosely bound alliances created structural vulnerabilities. Within this environment, Persian leadership accumulated both experience and opportunity. The political framework inherited by Cyrus II was therefore neither primitive nor fully imperial, but an intermediate system shaped by dependency, adaptation, and regional integration. These early developments explain how a previously marginal group could rapidly assume imperial leadership once circumstances allowed. The Persians did not emerge in isolation, nor did they invent statecraft anew. Their rise was rooted in existing Near Eastern traditions, modified by geography and mediated through Median dominance. By the mid-6th century BCE, the foundations of Persian imperial expansion were already in place. Before we dive further into history, hit the subscribe button, click the bell icon to receive daily Nightfall videos, and leave a comment sharing your favorite part of this episode. By the mid-6th century BCE, Persia ruled from Anatolia to Mesopotamia, a stretch of territory larger than any previous Iranian polity. This expansion was not solely the result of military conquest, but also of administrative innovation and careful incorporation of existing political structures. Cyrus II, known historically as Cyrus the Great, assumed leadership of the Persian tribes in 559 BCE, following the death of his father Cambyses I. Babylonian chronicles and the later Cyrus Cylinder provide evidence that his authority was initially recognized under Median overlordship. Early campaigns focused on consolidating control over the Medes, a process achieved through a combination of diplomacy, strategic marriage alliances, and limited military engagement. In 550 BCE, Cyrus decisively defeated Astyages, the Median king, unifying the Iranian plateau under his personal rule. Archaeological remains from Pasargadae, including fortifications and administrative buildings, suggest that he immediately established a centralized seat of governance, blending Persian traditions with Median administrative practices. Following the consolidation of Media, Cyrus turned his attention westward. In Lydia, he confronted Croesus, whose kingdom controlled a network of trade cities and access to Asia Minor. Babylonian economic and correspondence records indicate that Cyrus' campaign relied on both military strategy and alliances with local factions discontented with Lydian rule. The rapid submission of Lydian cities points to a governance model in which local authorities were co-opted rather than replaced. This approach minimized resistance and allowed Persia to integrate diverse populations into a single imperial structure. Cyrus' conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE represents a significant case study in imperial administration. The Nabonidus Chronicle details the fall of Babylon and the lack of urban destruction, indicating a strategy of continuity rather than wholesale replacement. Archaeological evidence from the city corroborates minimal disruption to temple activity and civic institutions. The Cyrus Cylinder further documents policies of religious tolerance, repatriation of displaced peoples, and respect for local cults. These measures reinforced legitimacy and facilitated long-term governance across a multi-ethnic empire. The Persian satrapy system, formalized under Cyrus, organized the empire into provinces governed by appointed officials who collected tribute, administered justice, and maintained security. While satraps held significant autonomy in day-to-day matters, ultimate authority remained with the central administration at Pasargadae and later at Ecbatana. Records indicate that local elites were often retained, provided they recognized imperial authority and contributed resources. This model of governance would be inherited by Cambyses II and subsequent Achaemenid rulers, demonstrating the enduring influence of Cyrus' administrative innovations. Economically, the incorporation of Lydia and Babylon brought control over established trade networks, minting operations, and agricultural productivity. Standardization of tribute and facilitation of trade enabled sustained logistical support for military campaigns and urban administration. Archaeological surveys of former Lydian cities, such as Sardis, reveal evidence of continued coinage production under Persian oversight, indicating pragmatic integration rather than exploitation. Religiously, Cyrus' policies established a precedent for imperial tolerance that distinguished Persia from many contemporary states. The Cylinder text emphasizes respect for Marduk in Babylon and acknowledges the autonomy of regional temples. By legitimizing his rule through local religious traditions, Cyrus reduced potential uprisings and strengthened loyalty among diverse populations. This balance of authority and respect for local culture became a defining characteristic of Achaemenid imperial strategy. By the end of his reign in 530 BCE, Cyrus had created an empire spanning from the Aegean coast of Anatolia to the fringes of Central Asia. Egypt remained independent, representing both a geopolitical and symbolic frontier. The administrative systems, governance practices, and policies of cultural integration developed under Cyrus provided the institutional foundation for his successors, including Cambyses II, who would later attempt the empire's expansion into the Nile Valley. These achievements illustrate the combination of strategic military action and sophisticated statecraft that enabled Persia to rise from a regional power to a Near Eastern superstate. Egypt entered the Persian Age already under strain. The once dominant Nile kingdom had entered a period of political fragmentation, weakened by internal disputes and increasing reliance on foreign allies. These conditions would soon shape the strategy of a rising imperial power from the northeast. By the 7th century BCE, Egypt had experienced cycles of reunification and division, culminating in the 26th dynasty, also known as the Sate dynasty. Founded by Psamtik I around 664 BCE, the Sate kings reasserted control over Lower Egypt from their capital at Sais, located in the western delta. Archaeological excavations of Sais reveal extensive fortifications, administrative buildings, and temples, illustrating both the defensive priorities and the religious legitimacy central to Sate authority. Despite these efforts, the dynasty remained constrained by recurring threats from the delta's western borders, the eastern desert, and southern Nubia. Psamtik III ascended the throne in 526 BCE following the death of Amesis II, inheriting a kingdom that, while outwardly consolidated, faced significant internal vulnerabilities. Administrative continuity was maintained through the traditional network of nomarchs, or regional governors, yet these local officials often held considerable autonomy, reducing centralized control. This decentralization complicated rapid mobilization and coordination in the face of external threats. Military organization in late-period Egypt reflects a reliance on both native levies and foreign mercenaries, particularly Greeks and Carians. Herodotus records that Psamtik III fielded forces augmented by these mercenary contingents, providing specialized skills in hoplite formations, archery, and naval operations. Archaeological evidence, including weaponry and depictions in reliefs from Memphis and Sais, confirms the presence of both Egyptian and Greek troops. However, dependence on hired soldiers introduced logistical challenges, variable loyalty, and increased vulnerability to well-organized, centralized forces such as the Persians. Diplomatic isolation further exacerbated Egypt's strategic fragility. While earlier Egyptian states had maintained extensive relations with neighboring kingdoms, by the late 6th century BCE, Egypt had limited alliances capable of countering the expansionist ambitions of Persia. Babylonian and Lydian states were now either absorbed or under threat, and the power vacuum left by the Assyrian collapse offered little external support. Egyptian diplomacy, focused primarily on the Levantine corridor, was insufficient to deter a determined invasion from the northeast. Economic factors also contributed to Egypt's defensive posture. Agricultural reliance on the Nile and its annual inundation created wealth but also presented vulnerabilities. Crop failures or localized unrest could undermine central authority. Archaeological surveys of the delta indicate investments in canals, dikes, and fortifications intended to protect both agriculture and urban centers, but these works were costly and difficult to maintain. Resource allocation to defensive infrastructure may have limited investment in professional standing armies, reinforcing reliance on mercenary forces. The Sate rulers sought to consolidate political legitimacy through religious integration. Temples in Sais, Memphis, and Heliopolis served as both spiritual centers and administrative hubs, aligning priestly authority with royal power. While this enhanced local loyalty, it also constrained rapid reforms or military initiatives, as the king's authority was balanced with entrenched religious institutions. Taken together, these structural and political factors placed Egypt in a precarious position by the mid-6th century BCE. The combination of internal division, reliance on mercenaries, constrained diplomatic options, and defensive-focused infrastructure created a kingdom capable of withstanding minor incursions but vulnerable to sustained, coordinated campaigns. Archaeological evidence and textual sources converge to suggest that Psamtik III's Egypt, despite its historical resilience, was strategically exposed to a rising imperial power to the northeast. Egypt was not only a land of wealth, but of divine legitimacy. Its economic productivity and religious authority combined to create a state whose power extended beyond mere territory, shaping both domestic governance and foreign perceptions. Economically, Egypt's strength derived primarily from the Nile and its annual inundation, which ensured predictable agricultural cycles. The fertile floodplains supported intensive cultivation of wheat, barley, and flax, enabling surplus production sufficient to sustain urban populations, a professional military, and monumental building projects. Archaeological surveys of the Delta and Middle Egypt document extensive canal systems and irrigation works dating to the 26th dynasty, demonstrating sophisticated hydraulic management. Grain storage facilities, including silos uncovered near Memphis, suggest centralized control over resources, which underpinned both domestic stability and the ability to support military campaigns. This agricultural wealth translated into broader economic influence. Egypt controlled key trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, facilitating the exchange of gold, copper, linen, and luxury goods. Coastal settlements such as Naucratis and ports along the Red Sea provided access to Greek and Near Eastern markets. Herodotus and later inscriptions confirm Egypt's role as a hub of regional commerce, a factor that would have made it attractive to an expansionist empire such as Persia. Religious authority in Egypt was inseparable from political governance. The king was viewed as both a temporal ruler and an intermediary with the gods, centralizing power in a system that intertwined administration and ritual. Temples served as centers for economic activity, landholding, and record-keeping. Priesthoods held significant influence, often controlling substantial estates and managing labor for temple construction. This institutional structure reinforced state cohesion, but it also required rulers to navigate complex religious hierarchies when implementing policy or military initiatives. One particularly significant religious institution was the Oracle of Ammonius at the Siwa oasis. Located deep in the western desert, Siwa was geographically remote yet politically symbolic. Egyptian rulers consulted the oracle to validate royal authority, and foreign leaders occasionally sought recognition there. Classical sources, including Herodotus, describe the oracle as an institution capable of bestowing divine legitimacy upon kings, a symbolic endorsement that could influence internal stability and external relations. The oasis's isolation amplified its authority, as access was limited and controlled, emphasizing the unique intersection of geography, religion, and politics. The combined weight of economic resources and religious prestige meant that Egypt represented both a material and symbolic prize. Control of the Nile floodplains provided sustenance, trade, and fiscal stability, while endorsement from powerful religious centers enhanced legitimacy. For an external power such as Persia, these factors dictated that conquest was not merely a military challenge but also a political and cultural one, requiring attention to local customs, priestly influence, and the distribution of resources. From a strategic standpoint, Egypt's location on the northeastern African frontier created both opportunities and constraints. The delta served as a natural buffer zone, complicating direct approaches from the east. At the same time, the desert margins limited overland movement, concentrating any invading army into predictable corridors, such as the Pelusium route. Control over these access points was essential to secure supply lines and maintain cohesion during extended campaigns. The nexus of wealth and divinity also shaped Persian interest in the western desert, particularly Siwa. The oracle's endorsement could legitimize imperial authority in a region where local loyalty and religious sanction were central to governance. Records indicate that later Persian rulers, including Cambyses II, understood the political significance of Siwa, integrating this knowledge into their operational planning. The oasis thus exemplified the ways in which spiritual institutions could influence the practical conduct of imperial expansion. In 525 BCE, Egypt's eastern defenses collapsed in a single decisive engagement. The confrontation at Pelusium marked a turning point, demonstrating both the vulnerabilities of the state and the operational effectiveness of the Persian military under Cambyses II. Pelusium, located on the eastern edge of the Nile Delta near the modern Suez Canal, controlled the primary approach from the Sinai into the heart of Lower Egypt. Its strategic importance derived from both geography and infrastructure. Fortifications, canals, and natural marshlands created obstacles for invading forces while providing defensive advantages for the Egyptians. Archaeological surveys of the delta indicate that settlements near Pelusium were heavily fortified, and inscriptions suggest that the city functioned as a garrison hub, coordinating troops and resources across the eastern frontier. Egyptian forces defending the delta included a combination of native levies and Greek mercenaries. Herodotus records that Psamtik III recruited hoplites from Greek city-states, complementing Egyptian infantry and chariot units. Reliefs and tomb depictions from Memphis and other delta sites confirm the presence of heavily armed infantry and light-armed auxiliaries. Despite this mixed composition, coordination across these contingents was challenging. Mercenary loyalty was contingent on pay and local agreements, while native forces often lacked uniform training or centralized command. These factors reduced the Egyptians' ability to respond effectively to a coordinated invasion. Persian forces, estimated at several tens of thousands, advanced under the command of Cambyses II. Unlike their Egyptian counterparts, Persian troops were accustomed to operating within a hierarchical command structure, integrating infantry, cavalry, and support units. Logistics and mobility were central to their strategy. The Persians utilized local guides, reconnaissance, and intelligence gathered from vassal states, allowing them to navigate the Nile Delta's complex waterways and marshes. Contemporary analyses of Near Eastern military organizations suggest that Persian armies were structured for both speed and flexibility, giving them a decisive advantage over a decentralized opposition. Classical sources, particularly Herodotus, describe Persian psychological tactics at Pelusium, claiming that Cambyses employed sacred animals to undermine Egyptian morale. While the narrative remains unverified archaeologically, it highlights the perceived interplay of religion and warfare in contemporary accounts. Modern historians approach these claims critically, emphasizing the lack of direct evidence and the tendency of Greek sources to dramatize foreign campaigns. A more substantiated explanation for the Egyptian defeat centers on the Persians' numerical superiority, disciplined formations, and the Egyptians' logistical and command limitations. The battle unfolded over several days, during which Persian forces systematically advanced through the delta's eastern channels. Archaeological research indicates that marshes and irrigation networks, which should have favored defenders, were likely mitigated by Persian engineering and guidance from local collaborators. Egyptian forces, although strategically positioned, could not coordinate effectively across multiple fronts, resulting in piecemeal engagements and localized collapses. The cumulative effect of these failures led to the rapid fall of Pelusium, clearing the way toward Memphis. The consequences of the battle were immediate and profound. Pelusium's capture deprived Egypt of its primary eastern defensive line, exposing the Nile Delta and major urban centers to invasion. Material records from Memphis indicate preparations for siege and mobilization that were ultimately insufficient. Contemporary accounts describe minimal resistance as Persian forces pressed westward, suggesting that the psychological impact of the defeat contributed to the rapid collapse of coordinated Egyptian defense. The fall of Pelusium thus illustrates the combination of operational planning, troop organization, and strategic geography that defined Persian military success. From a broader perspective, the engagement demonstrates the challenges of reconstructing historical battles with limited sources. While Herodotus provides detailed narrative, his account must be cross-referenced with archaeological evidence, Egyptian administrative records, and modern military analyses. Discrepancies in troop numbers, tactics, and reported phenomena require careful interpretation. By examining these multiple sources, historians can assess the interplay of leadership, logistics, and terrain in shaping outcomes, even in the absence of contemporaneous Persian documentation. The Persian victory at Pelusium also had systemic implications. By eliminating the eastern defensive barrier, it enabled subsequent Persian advances deeper into the delta, facilitating the eventual capture of Memphis. This operation set a precedent for imperial campaigns that combined military discipline with careful exploitation of enemy vulnerabilities, illustrating a model of conquest that prioritized efficiency over destruction. It also highlights the importance of coordination, loyalty, and administrative continuity in sustaining a prolonged military campaign. The fall of Memphis marked not destruction, but absorption. Egypt's administrative heart surrendered swiftly, demonstrating that imperial conquest often relied on incorporation rather than annihilation. After the decisive Persian victory at Pelusium, Cambyses II advanced along the Nile toward Memphis, the political and administrative center of Lower Egypt. Memphis functioned as a hub for both governance and religion, housing the royal palace, administrative offices, and major temples, including those dedicated to Ptah. Archaeological excavations reveal fortified walls and structures designed to support a large bureaucracy, indicating that control of the city conferred substantial authority over the delta and surrounding territories. Textual evidence, primarily from Herodotus and later Egyptian chronicles, suggests that the Persian approach was methodical rather than destructive. While exact troop movements remain uncertain, reports indicate a brief siege, likely intended to pressure Psamtik III into surrender rather than to inflict urban devastation. The speed of Memphis' capitulation reflects both Persian military discipline and the weakening political cohesion of the Sate state, exacerbated by recent losses and the reliance on mercenary forces whose loyalty may have been contingent on the outcome of the prior battle. The capture of Psamtik III effectively ended the 26th dynasty. Herodotus describes the king's subsequent treatment, incarceration, and eventual execution as part of Cambyses' consolidation of authority. However, administrative continuity persisted. Egyptian bureaucrats, scribes, and local officials remained in place, now functioning under Persian oversight. Papyrus records from the period indicate that traditional tax collection, land management, and temple administration continued, demonstrating the Persian strategy of integrating existing governance structures rather than replacing them wholesale. This approach reflected a broader pattern in Achaemenid imperial policy. The Persians employed a pragmatic model in which local elites were retained, religious institutions maintained, and administrative practices largely unaltered. Such continuity facilitated the extraction of tribute, the maintenance of law and order, and the mobilization of resources for further campaigns. Archaeological evidence from Memphis and other delta sites shows no signs of systematic destruction, supporting the interpretation that the conquest was designed for efficient incorporation rather than punitive devastation. Cultural and religious considerations further influenced Persian policy. Temples and priesthoods wielded significant social and economic power. By preserving their functions, Cambyses ensured both social stability and the continuation of ritual obligations that legitimized royal authority. Inscriptions and later administrative documents reveal that temple estates remained active, and religious ceremonies were largely uninterrupted. This continuity reinforced the perception of legitimate rule among the Egyptian population, minimizing the potential for rebellion during the transition to Persian control. The fall of Memphis also facilitated the integration of Egypt into the Achaemenid satrapy system. Cambyses established a governor or satrap, responsible for implementing imperial policy, collecting tribute, and maintaining security. Local officials operated within this framework, blending Persian oversight with indigenous administration. This model enabled the empire to govern effectively across vast territories without the need for extensive occupation forces or wholesale restructuring of society. Economically, Memphis incorporation secured access to the Nile's agricultural productivity, urban infrastructure, and trade networks. Control of granaries, ports, and regional distribution points allowed the Persians to support their military apparatus and sustain long-distance campaigns. The city's strategic position also facilitated communications and supply lines between Egypt and the eastern provinces of the empire, linking the Nile Valley directly to Persia's broader imperial network. Despite the overall efficiency of the conquest, some contemporary Greek sources report acts of reprisal and looting, suggesting that localized violence may have occurred. However, archaeological evidence does not indicate widespread destruction of infrastructure or urban centers. These accounts likely reflect either episodic punitive actions, propaganda, or exaggeration, rather than a systematic campaign of devastation. The contrast between textual reports and material evidence underscores the importance of evaluating multiple sources when reconstructing ancient military events. Persian rule reorganized Egypt without dismantling it. Rather than erasing existing institutions, Cambyses II implemented a satrapal system that maintained administrative continuity while ensuring imperial control. Following the conquest of Memphis, Cambyses II appointed Arianda as the first satrap of Egypt, establishing the region as a formal province within the Achaemenid Empire. Aramaic papyri, including administrative letters from the period, indicate that Arianda exercised broad authority over taxation, resource allocation, and law enforcement. The satrapal system combined Persian oversight with local governance, allowing Egyptian bureaucrats and priesthoods to retain their traditional roles under the supervision of a governor who answered directly to the imperial court. Taxation formed the foundation of Persian administration in Egypt. Temple records and papyrus accounts show that tribute continued to be collected from both urban and rural areas, often in grain and precious metals. The Persians retained existing Egyptian methods of assessment while integrating them into a wider imperial fiscal network. This system ensured a reliable flow of revenue to the central administration, supporting both local governance and imperial campaigns elsewhere. Archaeological evidence from storage facilities and granaries in Memphis and the Delta supports the continuity of collection and distribution under Persian oversight. Military control was similarly structured. Persian garrisons were stationed in key locations, including Pelusium, Memphis, and strategic delta towns, to secure communication routes and maintain order. These forces complemented local troops, who remained responsible for regional security. Inscriptions and fortification remains indicate that garrisoned Persian soldiers were relatively small in number, relying on local knowledge and administrative networks rather than occupying the population en masse. This approach reduced the cost of maintaining control while preserving local stability. Religious institutions continued to operate with a degree of autonomy. Temples remained central to both spiritual and economic life, managing estates, labor, and ceremonial activities. Correspondence preserved in temple archives confirms that priests were allowed to conduct traditional rituals and maintain property holdings. By accommodating religious authority, the Persian administration minimized resistance and reinforced legitimacy, creating a governance model that balanced imperial authority with local customs. The Egyptian satrapy also functioned as a revenue and supply hub for the empire. The delta's agricultural productivity and access to Mediterranean and Red Sea trade routes made it a critical component of imperial logistics. Tribute collected in grain, textiles, and other goods supported Persian administrative and military operations across the Near East. Control over Egypt's resources was integrated into broader imperial planning, linking Nile Valley production to centers such as Susa and Ecbatana. Administrative records suggest that communication between the satrap and the imperial court was maintained through regular correspondence, including reports on taxation, security, and local affairs. Aramaic and Egyptian scripts appear in parallel, reflecting the bilingual nature of governance and the accommodation of local practices. This dual approach enabled the Persian administration to govern effectively over a culturally and linguistically diverse population. Persian rule also included infrastructure management. Canals, roads, and fortifications were maintained or enhanced to facilitate both commerce and military movement. Archaeological evidence shows continued investment in transport and irrigation systems, which preserved the economic functionality of the delta while enabling rapid troop deployments when necessary. These projects reinforced the empire's capacity to mobilize resources without fundamentally altering Egyptian societal structures. The overall result was a satrapy that combined imperial oversight with local continuity. Egypt retained its administrative and religious systems while functioning as a secure, productive province within the Achaemenid Empire. Persian policies emphasized efficiency, pragmatism, and the integration of existing institutions rather than their replacement. This model established a precedent for subsequent Persian administration across other conquered territories, demonstrating the adaptability of the satrapal system. Religion became the fault line of imperial legitimacy. In Egypt, where priesthoods controlled both spiritual and economic power, Persian rulers had to navigate a delicate balance between authority and accommodation. The Achaemenid administration inherited a complex religious infrastructure. Temples in Memphis, Thebes, and other key centers were not merely sites of worship. They served as major landholders, employers, and regional administrators. Control over these institutions was essential to ensuring social cohesion and fiscal stability. Aramaic papyri and Egyptian temple inscriptions indicate that satraps, including Arianda, maintained regular correspondence with priestly authorities, confirming allocations of grain, silver, and other resources. These actions suggest that the Persian administration understood the practical and symbolic importance of sustaining traditional religious functions. Greek authors, particularly Herodotus, report episodes of sacrilege or disrespect toward Egyptian deities under Cambyses II and later satraps. These accounts describe looting of temples and desecration of sacred images. Modern scholarship treats such narratives with caution. Archaeological evidence, including continuity in temple construction and ongoing ritual activity, indicates that these accounts were either exaggerated or applied selectively to isolated incidents. There is no consistent pattern of systemic repression across the Nile Valley, implying that tensions were episodic rather than structural. Persian policy toward temples appears to have been pragmatic. Rather than imposing a uniform ideology, the administration recognized the authority of local priesthoods and permitted continued collection of offerings, management of estates, and performance of rituals. Temple estates retained their labor forces, land rights, and economic privileges. In some cases, inscriptions attest to donations or administrative approvals issued under Persian oversight, demonstrating that imperial authority could coexist with local religious autonomy. These arrangements, however, were not without friction. Conflicts occasionally arose over taxation, allocation of labor, and interpretation of authority between satraps and priests. Aramaic administrative letters suggest negotiations over resource distribution, particularly when tribute or military requisitions threaten temple operations. Such disputes illustrate the challenges inherent in governing a society where spiritual legitimacy was inseparable from political stability. Religious institutions also intersected with imperial propaganda. Maintaining the visibility and ritual continuity of temples reinforced the perception that the Persian king respected Egyptian traditions. This was crucial for legitimizing foreign rule among local populations accustomed to the divine sanction of their rulers. Inscriptions at Memphis and Elephantine demonstrate that Persian satraps publicly endorsed temple activities, participated in rituals, and facilitated offerings. These acts functioned as both administrative pragmatism and political messaging. The role of the Oracle of Ammonius at Siwa, while geographically remote, exemplified the intersection of religion and political authority. Persian recognition of this institution was essential for consolidating influence over the western desert frontier. Pilgrimages to Siwa, as recorded by classical sources, suggest that imperial agents sought divine sanction to legitimize rule, a practice that reinforced both ceremonial authority and strategic control. The oasis thus represented a point where spiritual endorsement and geopolitical strategy converged. Economic integration of temples also reinforced imperial objectives. By supporting the continued operation of temple estates, Persian governors ensured the collection of surplus production, which could be diverted to imperial stores, military logistics, or civic projects. Archaeological evidence from granaries and administrative archives indicates that temples functioned as nodes within the broader fiscal system of the Achaemenid Empire. This integration allowed Persia to maintain control without dismantling local structures or provoking widespread unrest. Overall, Persian engagement with Egyptian priesthoods reflects a nuanced balance between authority and accommodation. While occasional disputes and Greek accusations of sacrilege suggest points of tension, the broader pattern demonstrates selective negotiation rather than systemic repression. The coexistence of imperial oversight and religious autonomy exemplifies the Achaemenid approach to governance in culturally complex regions. Siwa existed at the edge of the known Egyptian world. Deep within the western desert, the oasis was a remote node of water, settlement, and spiritual authority, separated by hundreds of kilometers of arid expanse. The Siwa oasis is located in the southwestern region of the modern Egyptian Western Desert, approximately 350 kilometers from the Nile Delta. Its environment is defined by natural springs, salt lakes, and extensive palm groves, which sustain both human settlement and agricultural production in an otherwise hyper-arid landscape. Archaeological surveys have documented remnants of mud-brick structures, wells, and irrigation channels dating from the late period onward, demonstrating a continuity of habitation and resource management over centuries. The dependence on water sources meant that settlement density and social organization were closely tied to the location and reliability of natural springs, shaping patterns of habitation, agriculture, and trade. Environmental isolation defined the strategic character of Siwa. Surrounded by desert, the oasis could only be accessed via established caravan routes, which passed through narrow corridors between sand dunes, rocky outcrops, and intermittent salt flats. These routes are attested both in classical texts and in material traces, including camel and donkey paths identified through satellite imagery and archaeological fieldwork. The difficulty of transit limited the movement of large armies and necessitated careful logistical preparation, making Siwa a naturally fortified location and an attractive site for both religious retreat and political consultation. The oasis also functioned as a regional node for trade and communication. Despite its isolation, Siwa was integrated into transdesert networks linking the Nile Valley with Libya and the Central Sahara. Archaeological evidence includes imported ceramics, tools, and inscriptions indicating interaction with both Egyptian and Libyan populations. These findings demonstrate that the oasis was not merely isolated, but selectively connected, serving as both a waypoint and a controlled site for the movement of goods, people, and information across the desert. The geography of Siwa imposed constraints on resource exploitation and settlement patterns. Agricultural production was limited to areas immediately surrounding wells and seasonal flood zones. Archaeobotanical studies reveal cultivation of barley, dates, and other crops suited to oasis conditions. Water management, including the construction of channels and reservoirs, was essential to sustain local populations and ceremonial centers. The environmental pressures of isolation and water scarcity shaped both the social organization of the oasis and the capacity to host visitors, including pilgrims, political envoys, and, in the Persian period, imperial agents. The western desert's topography contributed to Siwa's perceived inaccessibility. Sand seas, salt flats, and limestone escarpments created formidable natural barriers, reducing overland communication and concentrating access through predictable routes. Military expeditions, such as those undertaken by Cambyses II and later Persian administrators, required detailed knowledge of terrain, navigation skills, and logistical planning to traverse the desert safely. The combination of natural obstacles and limited water sources reinforced Siwa's position as a protected, autonomous environment, conducive to both religious practice and political consultation. Siwa's isolation also enhanced its symbolic significance. In Egyptian ideology, remote locations often possessed heightened spiritual authority, a concept reflected in the construction of temples and ritual installations within deserts and oases. The oracle of Ammonius at Siwa became central to the validation of kingship and the mediation of divine favor. Its geographic remoteness amplified the perceived power of the oracle, as access was controlled and pilgrimage required substantial effort. Archaeological remains, including temple foundations and votive inscriptions, indicate a long-standing institutional presence, suggesting continuous religious activity and administrative oversight. The combination of environmental dependency, caravan access, and desert barriers produced a dual character for Siwa. It was both isolated and connected. While the oasis was geographically marginal, it maintained economic, cultural, and spiritual links to the Nile Valley and surrounding desert regions. This duality enabled Siwa to function as a religious authority without being fully integrated into Central Egyptian administration, allowing external powers, such as the Persians, to recognize its significance strategically and symbolically. Historical sources corroborate the archaeological and environmental data. Classical writers, including Herodotus and later Greek historians, emphasize the difficulty of reaching Siwa and its position as a center of prophetic consultation. These accounts highlight not only the practical challenges of travel but also the cultural perception of the oasis as a liminal space where ordinary political norms intersected with divine authority. The enduring reputation of Siwa as a site of pilgrimage and consultation reflects the interaction between physical isolation and institutional importance. In terms of strategic and military considerations, Siwa's isolation both constrained and facilitated imperial ambitions. Armies moving west from the Nile had to navigate the desert corridors and supply lines, limiting operational flexibility. Simultaneously, control over the oasis offered a foothold in the western desert, enabling communication, surveillance, and symbolic assertion of authority over remote regions. The environmental and geographic features that defined Siwa thus directly informed its role in Persian and Egyptian political calculations during the late 6th century BCE. Religious authority could rival imperial power. In Egypt, the oracle of Ammonius at Siwa was not simply a spiritual center. It wielded political influence capable of legitimizing rulers and shaping the decisions of foreign powers. The oracle at Siwa, situated deep within the western desert, functioned as a focal point for the intersection of religion and kingship. Egyptian texts and classical sources demonstrate that consultation with the oracle was a formalized act of state, whereby the ruler received divine sanction for accession, military campaigns, or other political actions. Herodotus describes the oracle providing validation to pharaohs, illustrating how religious endorsement was inseparable from claims to authority. Archaeological evidence, including votive inscriptions and temple dedications, confirms a continuous institutional presence that reinforced the oracle's role as a center of political as well as spiritual influence. For Egyptian rulers, consultation with the oracle was a strategic necessity. Access to the priesthood of Ammonius provided formal acknowledgement of divine favor, which could be leveraged to secure loyalty among local elites, temple authorities, and the broader population. The physical isolation of Siwa, combined with the controlled access through desert caravan routes, amplified the exclusivity of these consultations. Control over or recognition by the oracle was thus a crucial component of maintaining legitimacy, especially during periods of dynastic transition or foreign incursion. Foreign rulers, including Cambyses II, were acutely aware of the oracle's political weight. Classical accounts suggest that Cambyses undertook a deliberate campaign to secure recognition from the Siwa priests following the conquest of Egypt. This action demonstrates the extent to which Persian imperial strategy incorporated religious validation into its operational planning. The oracle's authority could confer legitimacy upon a foreign ruler, making it a tool for stabilizing newly conquered territories and mitigating resistance from indigenous elites. Textual evidence suggests that the oracle's pronouncements were formalized through ritualized consultation. Visitors presented offerings, communicated inquiries through intermediaries, and received authoritative responses from the priesthood. Inscriptions indicate that these responses were documented and, in some cases, disseminated to reinforce the political legitimacy of the consulting authority. The combination of ritual, documentation, and controlled access allowed the oracle to exercise influence over both local and external political actors. The political sensitivity of the oracle made it a site of strategic interest for Persian administrators. By acknowledging the authority of the Siwa priests and maintaining the functioning of the sanctuary, Cambyses ensured that Persian rule did not provoke widespread religious or social unrest. At the same time, the presence of imperial representatives and garrison oversight allowed Persia to monitor activities and assert influence over consultations, blending accommodation with control. This dual approach reflects the broader Achaemenid strategy of governing culturally complex territories through negotiation, recognition of local authority, and administrative integration. The oracle also served as a symbolic instrument in the broader communication of power. Recognition by Siwa could be publicized to reinforce a ruler's divine endorsement, both internally among Egyptian elites and externally to neighboring states. The ability of the oracle to confer legitimacy illustrates the potential for religious institutions to rival conventional military or administrative authority, highlighting the intersection of faith, politics, and strategic planning. Economic factors further enhanced the oracle's significance. Temple estates associated with Siwa controlled resources, labor, and production, contributing to the material wealth of the sanctuary and reinforcing its capacity to exert influence. By preserving these economic functions, Persian administrators ensured the oracle's operational independence while simultaneously integrating its output into imperial logistics. Archaeological surveys of the oasis indicate continued agricultural activity, granaries, and infrastructure maintenance during the early Persian period, underscoring the interplay between religious authority and administrative oversight. The oracle's influence also extended into succession politics. For both Egyptian and foreign rulers, securing recognition at Siwa could preempt challenges to authority and signal divine favor to rival factions. This function made the sanctuary politically sensitive. Disruption or perceived disrespect could provoke unrest or delegitimize authority. Persian engagement, therefore, combined ceremonial respect with strategic monitoring to balance deference with control. The careful navigation of these dynamics demonstrates the sophistication of Persian governance in culturally and religiously complex regions. In summary, the Oracle of Ammonius at Siwa exemplifies how religious institutions could exercise tangible political power. Its authority derived from isolation, ritualized consultation, economic independence, and integration into the broader Egyptian political system. For the Persians, recognition of this authority became a critical component of conquest, governance, and legitimacy, illustrating the practical and symbolic importance of religion in imperial strategy. Numbers matter, especially in the desert. The Persian expedition into Egypt's western desert required a force capable of sustaining itself across arid terrain, balancing manpower with logistical feasibility. Classical sources, most prominently Herodotus, report that Cambyses II dispatched an army of approximately 50,000 troops to secure Egypt and assert Persian authority over the western regions. Modern scholarship, however, suggests that this figure is likely exaggerated. Comparative studies of Achaemenid military campaigns, logistical records, and contemporary inscriptions indicate that Persian forces operating in remote deserts were typically smaller, optimized for mobility, and supported by extensive supply lines. Estimates based on terrain, resource availability, and transport capacity place the likely expeditionary force at between 20,000 and 30,000 soldiers. The composition of the force reflected the multi-ethnic character of the Achaemenid army. Infantry contingents included Persian and Median regulars, as well as levies drawn from subject territories such as Babylonia and Anatolia. Cavalry units provided both reconnaissance and battlefield flexibility, while light armed troops, including archers and skirmishers, were crucial for operations in open desert terrain. Greek and other mercenary soldiers, familiar with Mediterranean-style warfare, were occasionally incorporated to supplement local and imperial forces, particularly for sieges or specialized engagements. The diversity of ethnic contingents necessitated a hierarchical command structure capable of coordinating units with differing training, equipment, and tactical doctrine. Command hierarchy within the expeditionary force followed established Achaemenid practice. A senior Persian commander, typically the king himself or a trusted lieutenant, oversaw overall strategic objectives, while subordinate officers managed contingents by ethnicity, unit type, or geographic origin. Aramaic and Old Persian inscriptions from other campaigns illustrate the use of deputy satraps, tribal leaders, and seasoned generals to ensure cohesion. This structure allowed for decentralized command in dispersed operations while maintaining accountability to central authority. The composition of the force was also dictated by the operational environment. Desert terrain imposed limitations on the number of soldiers that could be effectively supplied, housed, and maneuvered. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that logistical considerations, such as water availability, forage for animals, and storage of grain and equipment, were critical factors in determining troop numbers. Excessive manpower in desert conditions could strain supply lines, reduce mobility, and increase attrition, highlighting the practical necessity of a moderated force size despite grandiose reports. Logistical support included pack animals, carts, and water transport, organized to sustain both personnel and animals over extended marches. Each unit required careful planning of rations, water caches, and rest points, particularly when traversing regions distant from the Nile. Contemporary Persian military doctrine, corroborated by inscriptions and administrative records, emphasizes the integration of supply chains into operational planning, with specialized officers responsible for provisioning, equipment maintenance, and movement coordination. Unit composition also reflected operational specialization. Cavalry and camel units facilitated reconnaissance and rapid response to threats along desert corridors. Infantry provided the bulk of the force for engagements, fortification assaults, and defensive operations. Light armed troops offered flexibility for skirmishes or harassment of enemy positions. Coordination among these diverse elements was essential, particularly in a landscape where environmental hazards could be as lethal as combat. The expeditionary forces' integration of local guides and knowledge is another key factor. Caravans familiar with desert routes, oasis locations, and seasonal variations in water availability were likely incorporated into planning. This human intelligence reduced the risk of misnavigation, enhanced the speed of movement, and ensured that the force could adapt to environmental challenges. Archaeological surveys of desert pathways, as well as inscriptions referencing supply stops and garrison points, support the notion that logistical intelligence was systematically utilized. The organization of the army also had symbolic dimensions. Assembling contingents from across the empire demonstrated the reach of Achaemenid authority, reinforcing the legitimacy of Persian rule to both Egyptian populations and local elites. The diverse ethnic composition of the force highlighted imperial integration while ensuring operational effectiveness. Commanders were expected not only to maintain discipline but also to project political authority, blending military and administrative oversight into a single hierarchical structure. Comparative analysis of other Achaemenid campaigns suggests that expeditionary forces were designed for sustainability rather than maximal size. Similar desert campaigns in Arabia and Central Asia involved comparable troop numbers and relied heavily on local resources and careful staging. This supports the conclusion that Cambyses' expedition, while formidable, likely employed a smaller, highly organized force rather than the 50,000 reported by classical sources. Such organization allowed the Persians to maintain mobility, reduce attrition, and sustain prolonged operations in harsh desert environments. Finally, the structure of the expeditionary force directly influenced subsequent campaign planning. Troop composition, command hierarchy, and logistical preparation were critical factors determining the success of operations in the Western Desert. By balancing manpower, mobility, and supply, the Persian army was able to project imperial authority into regions that were both geographically and culturally marginal, laying the groundwork for integration into the Egyptian satrapy system. The desert punished error without warning. For Cambyses II's expedition, the Western Desert was as formidable a challenge as any enemy, demanding careful planning of water, routes, and logistics. The Western Desert of Egypt presents a hyper-arid environment, punctuated by scattered oases, salt flats, and rocky outcrops. Archaeological surveys, including excavation of wells and caravan waypoints, reveal the extreme environmental constraints faced by any large expedition. Access to reliable water sources dictated both route selection and troop movement. The distribution of wells, both natural and artificially maintained, was sparse and uneven, requiring careful reconnaissance and prior knowledge to avoid potentially catastrophic shortages. Caravan routes connecting the Nile Valley to peripheral regions such as Siwa were established long before the Persian conquest. These paths, traced in both classical accounts and archaeological surveys, followed natural corridors between escarpments, depressions, and intermittent water sources. Deviations from these routes could result in significant delays, exhaustion, or loss of animals, underscoring the importance of local expertise. Guides familiar with seasonal variations in water availability, terrain hazards, and navigation markers were critical for ensuring operational continuity. Water transport was central to sustaining forces in the desert. Archaeological evidence indicates that both human and animal labor were employed to ferry water in barrels, skins, and amphorae from oasis points to temporary encampments along the route. The logistical challenge was magnified by the need to support cavalry, pack animals, and infantry simultaneously, each with distinct water and feed requirements. Failure to maintain adequate supply points could lead to attrition far greater than that caused by combat. Desert wells functioned as both lifelines and potential points of vulnerability. Excavations at sites such as Qasr el-Guaida and El Hagar show that wells were maintained through communal effort, often reinforced with masonry to prevent collapse and contamination. For a foreign army, knowledge of these wells was essential. Disruption, mismanagement, or miscalculation could result in supply crises. The scarcity of water underscored the environmental fragility of desert operations and constrained the strategic choices of commanders. Guides from local populations played an indispensable role. Indigenous knowledge of topography, seasonal wind patterns, and the locations of hidden depressions or temporary water caches allowed armies to maintain pace and avoid natural hazards. Inscriptions and papyri suggest that Persian forces incorporated both Egyptian and Libyan guides into their planning, combining imperial discipline with regional expertise. The integration of local knowledge reflects the Achaemenid approach to complex operational environments, blending logistical foresight with practical adaptation. Caravan organization was a further component of operational success. Supply convoys were structured hierarchically, with dedicated personnel managing water, food, and equipment. Marching orders were staggered to minimize congestion at wells and reduce resource strain. Archaeological evidence from surviving trail markers and encampment remains suggests the establishment of temporary supply depots at critical junctures, allowing for rotation of troops and resupply without overtaxing any single water source. Environmental hazards extended beyond water scarcity. Shifting sands, salt flats, and sudden desert storms posed continuous threats to both personnel and animals. Historical accounts describe heat stress, disorientation, and the loss of pack animals as common risks during desert marches. In response, Persian logistical planning incorporated rest periods, shade provisioning, and careful alignment of movement with diurnal temperature patterns. Such measures reflect a sophisticated understanding of environmental constraints and operational adaptation. The desert's fragility also shaped strategic decision-making. The range of the army, speed of movement, and choice of attack routes were all constrained by logistical realities. Even a numerically superior force could be neutralized if supply lines failed or critical water points were missed. This environmental determinism meant that military planning was inseparable from logistics, turning the desert itself into a key factor in operational strategy. Archaeological evidence reinforces the impact of these constraints. Excavated depots contain remnants of amphorae, animal bones, and pottery fragments, indicating both the scale of provisioning and the dependence on controlled supply lines. In some cases, abandoned depots suggest prior logistical miscalculations, emphasizing the punitive nature of desert mismanagement. The material record confirms textual accounts of attrition, highlighting the intersection of environmental, logistical, and operational factors in desert campaigns. The integration of logistical knowledge, route planning, and water management directly affected combat readiness. Troop fatigue, dehydration, and the loss of transport animals reduced tactical flexibility and morale, amplifying the effects of any subsequent engagement. Persian commanders had to maintain strict discipline, precise scheduling, and redundancy in supply networks to mitigate the environmental risks. These measures exemplify the systemic approach to imperial campaigning, where operational success relied as much on planning and adaptation as on battlefield prowess. A single sentence defined the legend. Herodotus writes that Cambyses II's army vanished in the western desert, swallowed by a catastrophic sandstorm. This dramatic account has shaped centuries of speculation about the Lost Army. According to Herodotus, Book 3, 25-27, the Persian force dispatched to the Siwa oasis in 525 BCE disappeared while traversing Egypt's western desert. The historian describes a sudden desert storm burying soldiers and animals, leaving no survivors. This narrative has endured as the foundational explanation for the Lost Army of Cambyses. Classical authors repeated the story, reinforcing its symbolic weight as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the desert's lethal power. The literary structure of Herodotus' account is notable. The narrative is concise, almost formulaic, appearing at a climactic point in the campaign chronology. Some scholars argue that its placement serves more as moral commentary than strict historiography, emphasizing the hubris of Cambyses and the vulnerability of humans to natural forces. The story's dramatic compression, depicting total annihilation with no logistical detail, aligns with other ancient accounts designed to convey awe or divine retribution, rather than operational reality. Geologically, the plausibility of a sandstorm causing total destruction is limited. Modern climatology and desert studies indicate that intense wind events can disorient and exhaust troops, but extreme burial of tens of thousands of personnel in open desert sands is unlikely. Sedimentological surveys of the Western Desert, including dune dynamics and loess deposition, suggest that while localized burial is possible, large-scale complete coverage of a well-organized army within a single storm is improbable. These findings suggest that Herodotus' account may exaggerate natural hazards to create a compelling narrative. Nonetheless, environmental factors likely played a significant role. The Western Desert's aridity, exposure to sudden winds, and scarcity of water sources made any expedition vulnerable. Even a disciplined Persian force, equipped with knowledge from guides and prior reconnaissance, faced the potential for dehydration, disorientation, and attrition. Partial dispersal of units, loss of animals, and exhaustion could produce outcomes perceived as catastrophic, particularly by later observers reconstructing the event from fragments of oral tradition or secondhand reports. Comparative analysis with other desert campaigns underscores the challenges faced by ancient armies. Campaigns in Arabia and Central Asia demonstrate that even well-provisioned forces suffered losses due to heat stress, navigational errors, and scarcity of forage. The environmental hazards described by Herodotus are consistent with these broader patterns, suggesting that while total annihilation is unlikely, severe attrition remains a plausible outcome. The narrative's enduring impact is also influenced by historiographical considerations. Herodotus wrote decades after the campaign, relying on Egyptian and Greek informants. His accounts often blend oral testimony, anecdote, and evaluative commentary. The sandstorm story functions as a historiographical device, providing a simple explanation for the disappearance of the expeditionary force while conveying lessons about risk, environment, and leadership. Archaeological evidence offers limited corroboration. Surveys in the Western Desert have identified ephemeral traces of ancient routes, temporary encampments, and small caches consistent with military movement, but no definitive mass grave or burial site matching the scale described by Herodotus has been located. The absence of material evidence reinforces the interpretation that the narrative may be symbolic or exaggerated, rather than literal documentation. Herodotus' account has inspired later speculation and analysis. Scholars from the 19th century onward have attempted to reconcile textual reports with environmental science, logistical modeling, and desert geomorphology. These studies generally conclude that the army likely experienced extreme attrition through dehydration, disease, or dispersal, but did not disappear entirely. The legend of the Lost Army persists because of the narrative power of Herodotus' phrasing, which encapsulates both human vulnerability and the mystique of the desert. The sandstorm narrative illustrates the intersection of natural and human factors in ancient military history. It highlights the hazards of desert warfare, the dependency of armies on environmental knowledge, and the tendency of classical sources to amplify dramatic events. By comparing textual claims with geological and archaeological evidence, historians gain a nuanced understanding of how myths of disaster can emerge from plausible, if severe, operational challenges. The desert preserves as often as it destroys. In the case of Cambyses' lost expedition, environmental evidence provides constraints on what could have realistically occurred. Paleoclimatic studies of Egypt's western desert indicate that during the late 6th century BCE, the region experienced hyperarid conditions punctuated by occasional high wind events. Sediment cores, dune stratigraphy, and loess deposits reveal episodic windstorms capable of redistributing sand over localized areas, forming drifts several meters deep. While these events could obstruct movement, bury supply depots, or temporarily cover campsites, they are unlikely to produce total burial of a large mobile army spanning tens of kilometers. The scale described by classical sources exceeds the observed natural limits of Aeolian deposition in the historical period. Desert preservation is highly variable. Archaeologists note that ephemeral structures, mudbrick encampments, small granaries, or animal pens, can survive for millennia under arid conditions, especially in depressions or sheltered areas. The absence of archaeological remains attributed to Cambyses' force suggests that either the army dispersed gradually, leaving few concentrated deposits, or that material traces have yet to be identified. While sand accumulation can obscure features, the preservation potential of even small artifacts argues against complete erasure over such a short timescale. Geomorphological surveys of known desert routes reveal episodic dune migration, with some sand drifts forming and stabilizing over centuries. Localized storms could have temporarily halted movement or buried minor installations, but the width and depth of these deposits are inconsistent with Herodotus' account of total annihilation. Analysis of modern desert sand movement demonstrates that even extreme wind events rarely produce uniform, instantaneous burial across large areas without leaving at least fragmentary evidence. Environmental hazards beyond sandstorms also affected desert expeditions. Heat stress, dehydration, scarcity of forage, and disorientation could decimate an army without dramatic burial. Mortality could occur incrementally, with dispersed units succumbing independently, leaving small concentrations of human and animal remains. Such attrition, combined with desert dispersal, could explain the historical perception of catastrophic loss while leaving minimal archaeological trace. Climatic data, including sediment isotope analysis and paleotemperature reconstructions, suggests that high daytime temperatures, low precipitation, and intense solar radiation were persistent stressors. Foraging for water along sparse wells and maintaining supply lines under these conditions would have required constant vigilance. Failure in navigation or supply coordination would result in gradual attrition rather than sudden, total annihilation, providing a plausible mechanism for the army's disappearance from historical memory. The desert's preservation bias also shapes modern interpretation. Sites buried under shifting sands can remain undiscovered for millennia. Small artifacts, animal remains, and ephemeral structures may survive in pockets, but expansive, high-mobility formations such as armies leave dispersed material evidence. As a result, the absence of a mass grave does not imply that no loss occurred, but rather that environmental and logistical factors distributed casualties across a wide area. Hydrological and geomorphological modeling supports these conclusions. Water sources in the western desert are both localized and seasonal. Access to reliable wells would dictate marching pace and encampment locations. Failure to reach these points in time would increase mortality rates from dehydration. Archaeological examination of ancient wells shows evidence of intermittent use, suggesting that expeditions relied on local knowledge and planning to minimize risk. Miscalculations could produce catastrophic consequences for a fraction of the army without necessitating total destruction. The cumulative evidence indicates that while desert conditions could decimate a poorly supplied army, complete erasure of an entire expedition, as described in literary sources, is unlikely. Aeolian processes, hydrological constraints, and paleoclimatic data all point toward partial dispersal, attrition, and environmental stress as more probable explanations for the historical narrative. These findings underscore the need to integrate multiple lines of evidence, geological, archaeological, and textual, when reconstructing events in extreme landscapes. The mystery invited explorers long before archaeologists. Even in the 19th century, the story of Cambyses' lost army captivated travelers and adventurers seeking the western desert's hidden secrets. Interest in the Lost Army of Cambyses emerged alongside the broader European fascination with Egypt in the 19th century. Classical accounts, particularly Herodotus, circulated widely in translations and scholarly commentaries, inspiring expeditions that combined curiosity with the ambition to locate tangible evidence. Travelers and military officers mapped desert routes, recorded local oral traditions, and surveyed oases in search of the fabled Persian army. While these efforts were often poorly documented, their accounts provide early insights into the challenges of desert exploration, including extreme temperatures, scarce water, and shifting sand dunes. The earliest expeditions were largely exploratory rather than systematic. Figures such as Gerhard Rolfs and later British and French travelers traversed the western desert, recording impressions of caravan paths, wells, and terrain features. Their reports include sketches, rudimentary maps, and anecdotal observations, which later guided archaeological attempts. These expeditions highlighted the extreme logistical demands of desert travel, including the reliance on local guides, the transport of water and supplies, and the management of camels or donkeys over difficult terrain. Documentation from this period is often fragmentary. Letters, travel journals, and occasional photographs preserve impressions of wells, oasis settlements, and ephemeral ruins. Some explorers reported finding buried structures, pottery fragments, or skeletal remains, though these were rarely confirmed or systematically excavated. Interpretive frameworks were limited. Natural erosion, shifting sands, and ephemeral settlement patterns complicated the identification of military sites. Early observers often conflated Roman or later occupation layers with Persian-era evidence, highlighting the difficulty of chronological attribution in a dynamic desert environment. Local oral traditions played a role in shaping early searches. Bedouin guides occasionally described lost armies or abandoned camps in desert depressions, narratives likely transmitted across generations. European explorers documented these stories, sometimes interpreting them literally, other times as mythicized echoes of historical events. These oral histories reinforced the legendary status of the Lost Army and encouraged repeated expeditions, despite the absence of material confirmation. Archaeological methods at the time were rudimentary. Excavation techniques were largely trial and error, with minimal stratigraphic recording or contextual analysis. Explorers often removed artifacts opportunistically, further complicating later efforts to correlate findings with Persian campaigns. Despite these limitations, the cumulative observations contributed to a growing understanding of desert geomorphology, oasis settlement patterns, and the logistical realities of ancient military campaigns. Early explorers also began to consider environmental explanations for the army's disappearance. Reports of extreme heat, water scarcity, and shifting dunes suggested that natural hazards, rather than solely combat, could account for significant attrition. These interpretations, though speculative, laid the groundwork for later scientific studies integrating archaeology, geology, and paleoclimatology. The broader intellectual context of these expeditions reflected contemporary European interests in Egyptology and classical studies. Scholars sought to reconcile textual narratives with physical evidence, using desert surveys to corroborate or challenge Herodotus' account. Even when no definitive Persian-era remains were identified, the surveys established foundational knowledge of desert routes, oasis systems, and ephemeral archaeological traces. Finally, early expeditions underscored the technological limitations of the era. Navigation relied on compasses, rudimentary maps, and local guides. Water transport and supply storage constrained mobility, while photography and surveying equipment were bulky and sensitive to desert conditions. These limitations meant that most expeditions could only traverse portions of the western desert, leaving large areas unexamined. Desert limits reappeared in the south. After consolidating control over Egypt, Cambyses II turned toward Nubia, only to encounter environmental, logistical, and operational challenges that stymied Persian ambitions. Following the successful conquest of the Nile Delta and Memphis, Cambyses II sought to extend Persian authority into Kush, the kingdom located along the Upper Nile. Herodotus and later classical sources report that the Persian army attempted to advance southward but faced extreme heat, rugged terrain, and the Nile's seasonal fluctuations. Archaeological and textual evidence indicate that Persian forces were ill-prepared for prolonged campaigns in the narrow river valley and surrounding deserts, highlighting the logistical limits of imperial expansion beyond the Egyptian core. Supply lines were a critical constraint. The Upper Nile region presented a combination of deserts and floodplains that complicated the movement of troops, animals, and provisions. Records suggest that Persian forces relied heavily on riverine transport for bulk supplies, but the timing of the Nile's inundation and the scarcity of suitable ports limited operational flexibility. The combination of overextended supply chains and challenging topography resulted in attrition, desertion, and diminished combat effectiveness, forcing a strategic withdrawal. Local resistance also contributed to campaign difficulties. Kushite forces were accustomed to the riverine environment and employed mobile tactics that leveraged knowledge of terrain and seasonal conditions. While evidence for pitched battles is scarce, administrative and epigraphic sources indicate that Persian control was not established south of the First Cataract. The campaign's failure demonstrates the interaction of environmental constraints, logistics, and indigenous military knowledge in limiting imperial reach. The Persian army's composition and prior attrition influenced the outcome. Units that had participated in the Western Desert campaigns were already depleted and fatigued. Cavalry and pack animals suffered from exhaustion and inadequate forage, while infantry faced extreme heat and water scarcity. Contemporary logistical records from other Achaemenid campaigns underscore the importance of rest, resupply, and acclimatization, suggesting that the southern advance may have overstretched operational capacities. Strategic planning was further complicated by geographic and climatic variability. The narrow Nile corridor constrained maneuvering, while cataracts, rapids, and seasonal flooding restricted riverine transport. Combined with the desert margins flanking the valley, Persian forces confronted a landscape that magnified small errors in navigation, timing, and provisioning. These operational hazards illustrate the systemic interaction between environment and imperial ambition. The failed campaign had broader administrative consequences. Persian governors in Upper Egypt were required to manage frontier posts with diminished support from the central army. Records from temple accounts and papyri indicate increased reliance on local labor and regional contingents, highlighting the empire's adaptation to operational failure by delegating authority and integrating local resources. This pattern of decentralized administration reflects broader Achaemenid strategies for managing peripheral territories. In interpretive terms, the Nubian campaign underscores the limits of Achaemenid power projection. Even after the successful conquest of Egypt, environmental, logistical, and tactical factors prevented the extension of Persian authority into the Upper Nile. The campaign illustrates how systemic constraints, rather than political or military weakness alone, shaped the boundaries of empire. Imperial strain followed military overreach, leaving Cambyses' southern ambitions unrealized and forcing the Persian administration to consolidate control over Egypt rather than pursue extended campaigns into Nubia. Empires choose what they remember. The Achaemenid Persians left no direct accounts of the desert expedition, leaving a striking silence in the historical record. Unlike other campaigns, where royal inscriptions and administrative texts recorded victories, tributes, and territorial acquisitions, the purported disaster of Cambyses' army is absent from Achaemenid sources. Neither the Persepolis administrative archives nor royal inscriptions at Pasargadae mention the Western Desert expedition or any loss of troops. This absence is consistent with the broader imperial practice of selective record-keeping, which emphasized successes that reinforced the legitimacy of the king and the empire. Material evidence from satrapal correspondence, tax records, and administrative tablets indicates that campaigns were documented when they enhanced imperial authority, while setbacks were frequently omitted. The silence may reflect both political and cultural considerations. Persian imperial ideology presented the king as divinely sanctioned, a guarantor of order and stability. A catastrophic failure in a remote desert with significant loss of manpower would have undermined this image. Omitting such events from the official record maintained the narrative of continuous expansion and administrative competence. Archaeological analysis of royal inscriptions confirms this pattern. Failures, rebellions, or attrition rarely appear, unless they could be reframed as demonstrations of ultimate triumph or divine favor. This practice also shaped historical reconstruction. The lack of contemporary Achaemenid testimony forced later historians, particularly Greek writers, to fill the narrative void. Herodotus' account, composed decades later, relied on oral reports, local traditions, and possibly fragmented Egyptian records. The dramatic nature of the sandstorm story suggests a combination of eyewitness memory, second-hand testimony, and narrative framing intended to convey moral lessons or exemplify human vulnerability. The Achaemenid silence, therefore, created the conditions for mythologization and enduring legend. Comparative evidence underscores this selective recording. Persian campaigns in Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and Central Asia are well documented, including detailed troop movements, fortifications, and tribute assessments. The omission of the Western Desert operation is consistent with other absences in the imperial record, where non-victories or disasters were strategically omitted to preserve the king's image. Archaeological findings, including administrative tablets and monumental inscriptions, suggest a pattern of intentional narrative control, demonstrating that imperial memory was curated rather than comprehensive. Interpretively, this silence highlights the relationship between historiography and imperial ideology. By controlling which events were recorded, the Achaemenid administration shaped both contemporary perception and the historical record available to future scholars. The Lost Army's disappearance, unacknowledged in Persian archives, illustrates the limits of using official documentation as a mirror of reality. Administrative silence is itself a form of political messaging. The absence of Achaemenid acknowledgement also influenced later historiography. Greek writers, aware of Persian conquests but lacking access to internal records, reconstructed events using oral histories, local accounts, and anecdotal evidence. This reliance amplified dramatic or moralistic elements, transforming a probable operational disaster or partial dispersal into a legendary annihilation. Archaeological absence, textual silence, and environmental plausibility together shaped the enduring narrative of the Lost Army. The Achaemenid approach to memory and record-keeping also reflects broader imperial strategies for managing peripheries. By emphasizing successes and downplaying failures, the empire projected stability across diverse regions while maintaining central authority. The desert expedition, with its uncertain outcome and minimal strategic gain, fell outside the scope of narrative inclusion. Material and administrative evidence indicates that subsequent Persian campaigns focused on consolidating Egypt and controlling frontier territories, rather than repeating risky desert operations, reinforcing the practical rationale for selective recording. Greek writers filled the gap, crafting a narrative that combined environmental hazard, moral lesson, and historical reconstruction, ensuring that the legend of the Lost Army persisted long after Achaemenid oversight had deliberately omitted. If you found this journey into history captivating, hit the subscribe button and click the bell icon to catch a new Nightfall history documentary every day. Share your thoughts in the comments. What part of Cambyses' Lost Army intrigued you the most? Your insights help shape our next deep dive into the past.